Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of my program that I share with you is called World Watchers, and it is number 701. 701 broadcasts. This is May the 13th, 1985. Last week I went backwards instead of going to 700. You probably picked that up. It wasn't 670, it was program 700. So on your tape, if you have a microphone at home, press it down and change the number so people listening to the tape will know, or print on the outside, of course, correct the number. It might be corrected there for you already. But we want to keep these in the proper chronological order. Now, there was a lot of news on BITBURG, more that I'll be sharing with you this week, and more on the search for Joseph Mengele. The heat is on now. And the name Fritz KRAEMER came up in the Bay Area on San Francisco 3 times, once on a replay. But Fritz KRAEMER was unleashed into the proper news media on ABC radio, large radio and station talk show in San Francisco, and we'll talk about that. The program that Jim Eason has in the afternoon from 1 to 4 had a gentleman, John Toland, who's an authority on Nazi Germany, in quotes, authority. He also worked for a long time in Spain with Otto Skorzeny, I understand, and has an interesting connection with many of the existing Nazis today. He's written quite a few books on Nazi Germany, and he was a guest with Jim Eason on KGO, that's an ABC station, and somebody called in and asked him if he knew about Fritz KRAEMER. Now, I had been in the Bay Area several weeks ago handing out almost 100 sheets. I took up 200, but I preferred to speak individually to people there instead of just handing them out indiscriminately at the protests and the marches, the peace marches up there on the 20th of April. And I've also mentioned Fritz KRAEMER on Ray Talifiero's show. I've called in late at night. So they asked John Toland if he ever knew about Fritz KRAEMER. And his answer was, no, he'd never heard anything about Fritz KRAEMER. And the caller said that there was a man who was a mentor to Henry Kissinger, who works in the United States, of German extract. I believe he knew that much or said that. And the other one, Fritz KRAEMER, was Hitler's general. And then Toland went on and made a real boo-boo. He said it's a very common name in Germany, just as Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald, or Sirhan is in this country. But he said it's a very common name in Germany, and he never heard of it. And he was reminded by the person who called in that this man was tried at Nuremberg, which was an error, but it wasn't much of an error considering who he was talking to, because he was a defendant at the Dachau trials that were separated from Nuremberg, that were specifically the Malmedy massacre and the Battle of the Bulge and the horrors that went on there. And John Toland wrote a book over 300 pages on the Battle of the Bulge. In fact, his book, he writes about the Malmedy trial and leaves out the name of Fritz KRAEMER, who was very important to Adolf Hitler. So he said, no, he didn't know about him. He said there is this mentor of Henry Kissinger is in his country, but he doesn't know anything about Adolf Hitler's Fritz KRAEMER. Now, after that program, later in the week, another person called up Jim Eason when it was open talk time. It wasn't on any specific subject. They have a free time, and he called in, and he wanted to clarify the question that was brought up in the air to John Toland to make matters worse. Toland saying he didn't know. This man had a foreign accent. He said he had studied at the London School of Economics, which was very much part of Kissinger's background, Henry Kissinger, and also Peter Drucker. Peter Drucker brought Fritz KRAEMER to this country, all 3 of them from Germany. But he called in and he said he wanted to clarify it because he said regarding that KRAEMER matter that came up during the week, I did some studying on that, and the mentor to Henry Kissinger came to the United States in 1938. So the listeners, this is a wide listening audience of 60 or 80,000 people every day. It's 24 hours more in the evening, and it carries better at night. But he said he came to the United States in 1938. What he didn't say was that the man wasn't glued to the United States once he came in. He wasn't kept here. And that I have sent to the Army for his papers, and I've shared that with you before, that the KRAEMER that came to the United States put on a uniform as a U.S. Army intelligence in the American Army, even though he was German, and that during the Battle of the Bulge, when he took Henry Kissinger to Europe in December of 44, and November and December of 44, and during the time period up till the end of the war of May 1945, Kissinger's mentor, the German Fritz KRAEMER, was in 4 or 5 different countries. I'd have to look that up again: Scotland, England, France, and Germany. So the fact that he came here in 1938 doesn't mean that he stayed here, because he was, in fact, in Germany, and he could have been arrested when our troops got there, because the dates that he was in Germany, our Pentagon will not reveal to us. And then the second point was that he brought out that Hitler's Fritz KRAEMER was in charge of the Panzer the 6th Panzer Division, which was true. And he says he wasn't involved in the Battle of Bulge much except for plans, which was true. He wasn't a soldier in the field. He's plans officer and was to our Pentagon from 1948 until just recently, as late as 1975 or so. But he's a plans man. He isn't a battlefield man, but he was in the plans. And he said that he was a prisoner for 10 years. This person wanted to inform people on material that John Toland said he didn't know about. Well, this Fritz KRAEMER was not in prison 10 years. He was out by 1948, and the trial was in 1946. So the assumption was wrong on one, the time that he was locked up. The second point was off. So therefore, he was adding more fuel to this particular fire and not solving anything. But at least this is the first I've heard that the name Fritz KRAEMER has gotten out in this kind of form. And I've been on it for 2.5 years, hoping that you people who hear my broadcast or subscribe to the tapes will use that talk show format. Take the sheet you have that go with the broadcast and become informed, and call these radio people and talk about it and get that name circulating out there. I want to give an award to the person who did it. I don't know who did it, but finally somebody opened that up. Well, I got out John Toland's book on the Battle of the Bulge, specifically on that. It was published by Signet in 1959. And there are 4 people that are important to the Malmedy massacre as defendants there, but they're important because of their links to Senator Joe McCarthy, and also because they team up later through one of the 4, Otto Skorzeny, to form the Odessa, which is the world spy network against Jews for the eventual extermination of all Jews and the continuation of the policies of Nazism and these extermination policies. The men involved in the Battle of the Bulge, the 4 that worked together, that are in the docket together, that were with Adolf Hitler planning it, and they're together afterwards. One is Colonel General Joseph Dietrich, Dietrich, like Marlene Dietrich. The other is Mr. Jochen, Jochen, Piper, Peiper. That was another officer, Lieutenant Colonel Jochen Piper. The third was Lieutenant Colonel Otto Skorzeny, Skorzeny, and the fourth was Fritz KRAEMER. Now, in the Battle of the Bulge by Mr. John Toland, he has about 20 pages indexed on Colonel Joseph Dietrich, Colonel General Joseph Dietrich. He has over 20 pages in the index on Lieutenant Colonel Otto Skorzeny. He's got about 30 pages in references to Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Piper, whose picture was in the newspapers throughout the country when the president said he was going to BITBURG. That was the staging area for these gentlemen for the 1st Panzer Division, and over Mr. Dietrich was Fritz KRAEMER. So John Toland has a section on a whole book on the Battle of the Bulge, and he has a section on Malmedy, and very conveniently leaves out the name of KRAEMER, who he says is common like Smith, but he's sitting right there in the front row with prisoner number 33 identifying him. So you would think in a book on the Battle of the Bulge that he would at least be familiar with the name. Now, in his book, on page 370 on the Malmedy trials, he says, this was written in 1959, many of the German survivors of the Bulge are now dead. Modell committed suicide. Ronstedt died in an old folks' home near Weinhausen. That was von Ronstedt, who worked with the Polish division and near Krakow and Wadowice, and was in charge of sending the Ukrainians into the ovens from the Polish area. And then Hitler brought all of these men to the front to be part of being rounded up by the Americans and the Germans who were in America to use them later. But he says that Ronstedt died in an old people's home, so he was not in prison, and Modell was out free when he commits suicide, in quotes. Then he says that the Malmedy trial in Dachau in 1946, Piper was sentenced to hanging and Dietrich to life imprisonment. And he says 42 defendants were sentenced to be hanged. That was pretty strict, considering that our President of the United States is at the staging area saying that these were all innocent young men, and the survivors, 42 were to be hanged and 23 to get life in prison. And he says that Piper was to hang, Dietrich would never get out. And then he tells about Colonel Willis M. Everett, Jr. of Atlanta, Georgia, who was sent by the United States government and Senator Joe McCarthy, and even put in $40,000 of his own money because of his efforts. This is what Mr. Tolan writes: because of the efforts of Colonel Everett, Dietrich and Piper were freed and now live under probation near Stuttgart. Well, what I shared with you last week was the fact that Mr. Dietrich went on with Hans Ulrich Rudel and Otto Skorzeny down to South America to set up the World Nazi Organization. Piper was living in France. They were not under any kind of probation, and the name that's left out of this whole section on the trial and in the book happens to be Fritz KRAEMER. That's why it's so hard to smoke out this guy, and we have to get his name known, because these historians are lying and leaving it out and making him a non-person for the history books. He went on in this book, Skorzeny lives in Madrid under a different, he gives his passport, his alias, and he hopes someday to come to the United States to teach his commando tactics. Now, Hans Ulrich Rudel and Otto Skorzeny were part of the links to Mr. Erlanger up in Buffalo, who meets with Richard Butler in Idaho, the engineer from Lockheed that worked at Lockheed when then Caesar was there, and Robert Kennedy was killed, worked with Reverend Gale, Lieutenant Colonel Reverend Gale, with the identity movement, and the Nazi movement that is in the news just this past week with their computers over the states, identifying people that should be killed in the future, the Jews to be hung from the lampposts and have their throats cut. They fit right to this group, and Don Tolan is out there preaching the fact that he's the authority on Nazism, and is one of the great artists at covering up the whole event. Now, I got his book. I have his 2-volume book on Adolf Hitler. It's got only 1,073 pages. And again, in the story of Adolf Hitler and Nazism, he has Mr. Dietrich, Mr. Piper, Mr. Skorzeny, but you go to page 1089 in the index, and there's no Fritz KRAEMER. He doesn't exist in the life of Mr. Tolan, John Tolan. But he does have some interesting pictures in his book on the Battle of the Bulge, and one of them is Maxwell Taylor. Well, Maxwell Taylor not only was important to the Battle of the Bulge with William Donovan and William Casey, but he was important to our horrible events that were so outrageous in Southeast Asia with the Agent Orange, with the Phoenix program, the killing of about 2 million Vietnamese, the decimation of the land. Then Taylor was just meeting this February in the Pentagon with the Defense Department with John Singlaub and Mr. Adeholt, both retired officers of the military who linked directly to the Waffen-SS through the World Anti-Communist League and other organizations in 1985. Their history of counterinsurgency, of Nazi tactics, of working with the Nazis, was signed and sealed in this Battle of the Bulge area, and these men went on to have important jobs later that have influenced this country to where it became like Nazi Germany. As a matter of fact, as an epilogue in the book by John Tolan on the Battle of the Bulge, he said many of the Allied participants went on to greater fame. Eisenhower became President of the United States. Montgomery was the chief of SHAPE, that was the entire Army organization group. Bruce Clark, commander of the 7th Army in West Germany. Maxwell Taylor became chief of staff of the Army. James Gavin, the public conscience of the Army. And he runs down some very important people from the Bulge, and I have about 30 or 40 more, Prince Bernhard, who formed the Bilderbergers, and so forth. Now, I have shared this with you before, but because it's so crucial to the BITBURG story and to the way history lies, and I have to illustrate this for new listeners, and sometimes I have to repeat these stories to prove a certain point, I just want to bring out a few sentences and references to the fact that Fritz KRAEMER did, in fact, exist. It is history that he was prisoner 33. You just don't end up in the dockets where a whole group of men are getting life sentences and are supposed to be hung for having done no ill deeds. The book, The Damned Engineers by Janice Giles, this was published in 1970 by Houghton Mifflin, has a section on the 1st Panzer Corps. This was their staging area at BITBURG and their importance to Hitler, and goes on about KRAEMER and Dietrich and Piper and Skorzeny. I'll just cite a few pages. One quotation of Hitler had rested his highest hopes on the 6th Panzer Army, and that was The plans of it were supposedly done by Fritz KRAEMER. Mr. Dietrich had his hopes on the 1st SS Panzer Division. In the top sector of the 1st Panzer Corps, the 1st SS was the 12th SS Panzer Division, which was Hitler's favorite. The 1st Panzer Division was called the Liebstandard Adolf Hitler, commanded by SS General Wilhelm Mohnke, M-O-H-N-K-E. I gave his name before because he left this important area, the Battle of the Bulge, where all his boys were in the hands of Americans, and then went to the German bunker with Adolf Hitler and Martin Bormann and the top Nazis that would fly down to Antarctica and South America later. He double-dipped into the two areas. This book goes on. The Liebstandard Division had its proud origin in the elite original bodyguard unit with its cracked armored regiment. The 1st Panzer Regiment was also the Death's Head unit. The Death's Head began as concentration camp guards. In 1940, they chose the youngest and the best of these men. That they were taken out and put into military units from the concentration camps. The 1st SS Regiment was therefore not only Liebstandard, but Totenkopf, T-O-T-E-N-K-O-P-F, and their insignia was the Death's Head. Piper was working, on page 121, it tells about Piper working with Mr. Dietrich, and they deduced where the offensives would be near the Ardennes, and he was to have a key role when General KRAEMER, the Chief of Staff of the 6th Panzer Army, asked him about his offensive through the Eifel and how long it would take the regiments to travel. So KRAEMER is there at that scene as an advisor, but at the end of the war, nowhere do I find any books about him in the divisions that were in Poland or Czechoslovakia or Hungary or France or Holland or Belgium. He was in America at that time. On page 108 and 109, it tells about the allegiance of the 6th Panzer Division. That was Fritz KRAEMER, and it refers to details of the plans and operations of Brigadier Führer der Waffen SS Fritz KRAEMER, operation of the 6th Panzer Army at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and I had sent for those papers, and it tells about how Hitler called in his favorite people for the ending of the war, or the winding down there from the 6th and 1st Panzer Division, and Sepp Dietrich was his favorite, his old friend. They fought together in World War I. He was a faithful follower of the Fuhrer, and along with him, he was Chief of Staff General Fritz KRAEMER. Although their goal was Antwerp, and they understood to achieve it, KRAEMER had an excellent encirclement of Liège, and Piper and KRAEMER were, along with Adolf Hitler, and were called in simultaneously with their friend Otto Skorzeny, who would meet and work with them after the war. And also, Henry Kissinger was taken from the haylofts to the castle in Germany with KRAEMER and Skorzeny and Klaus Barbie and the Nazis who would form the Odessa later. Just finally, in the book Hitler's Last Gamble, it tells about General KRAEMER, the Chief of Staff, who was present throughout all the interviews with the Army commander and how he spent his time listening to plans for the war with Sepp Dietrich. And on page 111 of the same book, it tells about the role of Fritz KRAEMER and Sepp Dietrich and the psychological warfare and their planned entry into France. So just citing two books, Hitler's Last Gamble and The Damned Engineers, these men were very sick during the war, the last stages where they were rounded up by the Americans, and that's the important point, and Mr. Tolan had not heard of them. Now, it's very important that you call stations and keep this on the air and keep bringing it out. Now, why is Fritz KRAEMER so important? Why do I talk about him so much? He shares the offices, and I've given you the address, and I put on the letter to the president and the foreign news media. Now I have to get out to more people in the American media. Shares offices in Washington, D.C. with Daniel Graham. One area of Daniel Graham and his influence was Star War and Edward Teller and the hydrogen bomb. Those key connections are very important. And also Fritz KRAEMER is the mentor to Henry Kissinger, who makes our policies in Southeast Asia, Middle East, Central America, South Africa. Henry Kissinger is their roving ambassador. Now, last week there was an article, May 3rd, 1985, in the Washington Post. Private groups step up aid to CONTRAS. You might have read that Reverend Moon is editor, Mr. Arnaud de Borchgrave, the great agent provocateur in the Pope shooting, trying to blame the KGB when Ajah worked with Frank Turple in the CIA. He's the editor of that paper. This is a different article on private groups, Step Up Aid. And the kingpin of those groups is the same John Singlaub that I've been trying to put on the air, but I haven't done enough time to do justice to the John Singlaub and his various connections to the far right wing. But in this one article, it tells about Singlaub working with the NDR, the Contras in Nicaragua. When Congress says you can't have money for these atrocities, then Singlaub and his organization, which is the government behind our government, and it's not invisible any longer, says, well, here's 10 million, 40% of that was for arms. He also is associated with American Cares. I've briefly touched that, and they recently gave $14 million. He's part of the Knights of Malta from the Vatican, and they gave $20 million to the Contras. The World Anti-Communist League sent $2 million with arms coming from Argentina and Brazil and various fascist countries. That while the president in there has changed in Argentina and Bolivia to be a democracy, it's a very thin democracy and could fall flat, and they're still continuing squeezing out from the private groups, just as we're supposed to be a democracy, and the Congress says, don't send it. We have people that are arming the Contras, and that's happening in those countries. He's also president of the World Anti-Communist League, the international group that I talked about, and the greetings that the president sent in San Diego in September to their convention. And he's head of the United States Council on World Freedom, USCWF. Now, on the board of the United States Council of World Freedom is Daniel Graham, who shares those offices with FRITZ KRAEMER. And they get money from Joseph Coors. They get a large hunk of money from Texas oil money. And they originally started this organization in 1981 with $20,000 from Taiwan and the family of Chiang Kai-shek. So wherever you go, that one of these tentacles is going to prong in to Daniel Graham and FRITZ KRAEMER. They also mentioned in this Washington Post story that Singlaub is on the board of Western Goals. The late Larry McDonald was head of. On Western Goals is Edward Teller, and it was set up by Mr. Milliken of the Knights of Malta and J. Peter Grace. The money originally went into Western Goals and funds John Reese, who was seen publicly and lecturing with Daniel Graham. And in California, Ed Davis, the former chief of police when he covered up the murder of Robert Kennedy and protected Thane Caesar, who works with Richard Butler, the Lockheed engineer who's the head of the Aryan Nations. He is the West Coast representative for Star Wars for Daniel Graham. So these names that I have been pulling out, and I've been accused often of using too many names, appear and reappear and reappear, so you're not going to have too much trouble just looking at the names now. If you are loyal and follow these programs every week, you can suddenly, if you didn't see it before, the overlapping of these people helping each other. This Washington Post goes into the fact that Reverend Moon puts money into helping fight the Contras. We know he does through a group called CASA. And it even mentions that the Japanese chapter of the World Anti-Communist League was founded in 1960 by Ryoshi Sasakawa, a wealthy conservative businessman who heads Japanese shipbuilding. It's called Shipbuilding Industry Foundation. He was jailed as a Class A war criminal after World War II and then started to fund the Unification Church, a menace to the United States, a menace to freedom, linked to Mussolini, Franco, Hitler, the Japanese mafia. Reverend Moon's newspaper is now has Borchgrave as the top editor, and they overlap very nicely to become a small family of people that have taken away the positions that our Congress has on whether it's decent or moral to allow the torture and murdering that's going on now in the name of anti-communism. Now, there was a story this last week that I briefly mentioned before it became a big story, and as far as I know, the tragedy of this particular item that I'm going to share with you is the way it's been suppressed in the newspapers around the country. As of today, I haven't seen any headlines or stories or even a small print from around the country on this matter. I mentioned a few weeks ago that Bill Graham, the music promoter, the rock promoter, was having a concert to express his anger against Ronald Reagan and is going to BITBURG. And he opened up, at least for the first time for the public, maybe people knew it and I didn't know it, that his mother and sister had been killed in concentration camps. And he paid $11,000 for an ad in the San Francisco Examiner and the San Francisco Chronicle saying, don't go to BITBURG. And there was a demonstration In San Francisco at the Union Square, there was a rally, and one woman carried a picture of Ronald Reagan with a mustache with a swastika behind him and a swastika on his two collars. And there was various speakers there. Senator Milton Marks was there. It was a 3-hour rally, and members of the Board of Supervisors from San Francisco, and he was objecting the president going. And when I heard that he spent $11,000 in there, and I'm scraping together some money for postage stamps on the president and the scandal of his being with Richard von Weizsäcker and going to Bitburg, where I understand the full history and the symbolism of what he's doing, I called the office and said, if Bill Graham wants information on Reagan and Bitburg, why doesn't he come down here? I'll share it with him. And I also wrote a long letter sending a lot of printed material to him. He left for Europe right after that demonstration, and I left the next day to go to Los Angeles and didn't get back till Monday night to do my broadcast. And Tuesday or Monday at 3 in the morning, the entire Bill Graham warehouse offices just south of Marcus Street were burned to the ground. Now, a lot of you don't follow rock music. Some of you know a few of the musicians by name, but you don't know the climate that he produced in San Francisco. Bill Graham's art form became as much American art form, I believe, as the light opera and jazz and American quilts. It definitely changed the whole fabric of America, the feelings of the youth, the getting together of the rock musicians. It brought all the wrath of the COINTEL program down and the complete decimation and drugging and killing of the rock musicians. That was the Reagan-Edwin Meese administration out here in California, cracking them on their skull wherever they could. Now, to burn a museum, it was filled with all kinds of pictures and mementos of everything he had of that era, is a terrible tragedy. You may not feel it if you weren't part of that milieu and are not sympathetic to the music scene, but many of you who've listened for a long time know that I have continuously studied the scene of the musicians and have been always sensitive to their performances. Every single, we got for the family, every single performance, the Monterey Pop, and went up north to see the Beatles. That was their last concert at Candlestick Park when they gave their very last. We didn't know it was their last, but we had enough good sense to take the children up there to see it, and up to see Bob Dylan in San Jose, and everywhere that we could. We went as a family, and I continued the interest after that, and they have been interested in music, and the rock music scene went more to Ticketron and commercial, so there was a sharp break after the COINTEL program began closing it down. But the one story in the San Francisco Examiner, April 27th, no Bitburg Reagan told at Union Square rally. Well, what happened after the Union Square rally? As I say, 1 week later, the newspapers had accounts that read like this: Graham headquarter fire called arson, motive unknown, and then it tells about things that went up in smoke, his belongings. He had autographed photos from John Belushi, the Grateful Dead, the Rolling Stones, the Who, Janis Joplin, all over the office. They were destroyed. Also, the first accounts of the Graham fire, I heard the morning news, they said Graham fire on the air, more details at 11:30, and I thought, holy mackerel, it can't be Bill Graham, but of course it would be. And the very first news said that somebody called around 3 in the morning. There were 2 people in San Francisco with Nazi uniforms that were seen in front of his building on Howard Street. And then later somebody called in and said that the Nazis, they took credit for this particular fire, but these mementos going down. Nothing about Nazi uniforms later. News stories followed, like May the 8th, San Francisco rock impresario's office is burned. $1 million fire destroys memorabilia, and details of what he lost in this terrible fire. Arson suspected, 4-alarm blade. Bill Graham's office is outed. Graham's new office gets treasures that survived the fire. And this tells that one of the things that burnt was the only picture he had of his parents who were killed in Nazi Germany. And interestingly enough, the show that he was presenting, he still promotes musical shows. The show went on the next evening, even though the buildings had burned down, at the Warfield Theater on Tuesday night, 3 a.m. is the fire. It was business as usual for the Graham outfit, which presented a concert by Julian Lennon. If you want to choose your symbols carefully, as Helmut Kohl's aide said, you have one where the entire Graham memorabilia is burned down, and that next evening he's presenting Julian Lennon, and if you haven't heard him, he is really an echo of the past. You can get goose pimples thinking of John Lennon. He sounds so much like him. And Bill Graham was quoted in the newspapers saying, Reagan is a despicable, inhuman creature, and of the BITBURG visit, he said, I'll despise him for it until the day I die. We'll take a 1-minute break, and then I just want to do a little bit more on the rock musicians and Ronald Reagan and the things that I had been saying about him as he moved up to become president from 1979 on. And the handwriting was on the walls. I should have had the help of these people or the understanding to stop Reagan before it got so far. This is part 2 of Mae Brussell's broadcast. This is Mae, for those of you that might have turned in the middle or got lost and didn't catch the beginning. This is broadcast number 701, May the 13th, 1985, and the program is called World Watchers. Now, the importance of John Singlaub and Daniel Graham and the FRITZ KRAEMER that I keep bringing up and out has nothing to do, it has a lot to do with the battle, the bulge in the past. It has nothing to do with burying the past at all. Jack Anderson had an article a year ago. This was February the 9th, 1984. I might have had it on the air then, and it's applicable to the burning of Bill Graham's buildings and to John Singlaub as an advisor in the Pentagon today. He's the current president of the World Anti-Communist League, working with Reverend Moon and Bill Graham and the police department in Los Angeles, the Western Goals. And as I understand, they just opened their offices in London this week, Western Goals, and John Singlaub is on the board of that. They have a member of the Luftwaffe on that board and direct contact to the BND, the Galen Group in Germany. Jack Anderson wrote, the jackboot and swastika lurk behind the continuing slaughter of tens of thousands of Latin Americans by right-wing death squads. Hitler's 1,000-year Reich, the concept of it, the anti-Semitism, the racial purity survived among right-wing elements in Latin America and also in the United States with Soldier of Fortune, Eagle, and the magazines set up, the survivalist magazines were set up by these Nazis and the Klan and the World Anti-Communist League. The taking of America will become from these actual domestic-grown mercenaries. When they run out of jobs overseas, will begin to sweep up. And they're already, they've declared war May the 1st in the United States, and the burning of Bill Graham's material in offices is an indication that within just a few days of the war that they said would take place. Jack Anderson sent his aide to Argentina, Paraguay, and Chile to look into the Latin American death squads and found that they are part of the Latin American Anti-Communist Confederation, which is part and started from the World Anti-Communist League. They ran into men in a group called CAL, C-A-L, out of Guadalajara, Mexico. Remember, I read this to you a while back. They had set up their death squads. They have marching orders. They belong to a secret society run by powerful anti-Semitic businessmen and lawyers. And speaking of secret societies, in a few weeks I'm going into George Bush as a skull and crossbones from Yale, digging up a grave to be initiated into that society, and public officials who are part of those secret societies and can become vice president and even president of the United States. Jack Anderson said sources of the World Anti-Communist League say that the group in Guadalajara uses their anti-Semitic credentials to solicit money from wealthy Arabs, and one World Anti-Communist letter said that the Middle East had pledged $50,000 to the League in 1978 at their conference. Tom Davis was asking me the role of the Arabs in Saudi Arabia into this spy network. They're tied in and very much part of the World Anti-Communist League. They send money to the PLO. One former official of the World Anti-Communist League, a notorious proponent of Nazi superior race theories, and we're talking about the branch in the United States with their conventions here in the United States, in New York or in San Diego. Their world conventions include the United States and people from our country, such as Strom Thurmond and Jesse Helms and Phyllis Schlafly and her husband. But going on to this one particular article, it said they are anti-Semitic, they're racist, they're Nazi, they're pro-Nazi, neo-Nazi. They work under the label of fighting for nationalism and nationalists. But one gentleman was bragging about the fact that he personally hid Dr. Joseph Mengele on his exodus to Paraguay, and ever since World War II, the right-wing military in Latin America have idealized the Nazi war machine. The Germans of Adolf Hitler's era are depicted as supermen, in Latin American magazines, just as they are in our magazines that sell the uniforms and weapons of the Waffen SS, and their Mengele was honored in Paraguay with citizenship, and also he's an advisor along with Klaus Barbie down in South America where they advise the death squads. Now that kind of activity with American agents is coming into and has been part of American death squads for a long time, but when they start burning buildings and wearing uniforms and taking credit, they want brownie points for all of their work. Last April the 1st, I did a broadcast on Soldier of Fortune and their ads for Waffen SS uniforms. This is at a time when the President of the United States is going to the graveyard of the staging area of the Waffen SS, where 47 of them were buried, and it's about Major John Singlaub and his work with the Nazis and the Waffen SS, and Singlaub's name again was in the Washington Post, a big story and a full page in the Washington Times, Reverend Moon's paper. So the San Francisco fire had an origin, and it was as obvious to me, or if anybody would have studied this, what is going to come is going to be much worse than what happened, and what happened is just a warm-up based upon the track record of the people involved. Now, I stuck my neck out and did something for Bill Graham, and only for him, because I'm sympathetic to what he did and what his music, bringing those people out, did to my personal life, and how it affected us personally and the people around our culture and society. And I wanted him to come here. Of course, he had just come back from Europe, or wanted the fire department and alcohol, tobacco, and firearm. We're working on the case. And I gave them information about stormtroopers in San Francisco, about the National Socialist Party in San Francisco, activity they had been involved in before, and the Adolf Hitler Awards and Leadership Medals, the people associated with the goals of Adolf Hitler, whose primary goal, as they said, is to be able to serve the cause of Adolf Hitler in a position of trust and leadership. And this is part of a piece of material written up by a person whose lifelong goal and ambition is to serve Adolf Hitler with unlimited talents to do just that, and also very heavy into the San Francisco area, the San Francisco police. It's the police of Dan White, the Zodiac killings, the SLA, the place where the police are literally members of the Gestapo and have had that network for a long, long time. Back in 1979 on broadcast number 414, and we're up to 701, I was talking about the zebra killings in San Francisco and the use of the COINTEL program set up by the FBI. The COINTEL program at that time was under the direction in the 70s, when all this violence was coming down, under Tom Charles Houston. Tom Charles Houston trained in the Pacific with Charles Willoughby, Mr. Kurt Wiedenbach, and with agents associated with Lev Dobryansky, Reagan's ambassador to the Bahamas. I just briefly touched on him, and will update that as soon as possible, and his Ukrainian quarterly magazine and his links to Nazis overseas and in the South Pacific, and Tom Charles Houston of the COINTEL program, I just learned in the last few years, was very much a part of the Nazi network in Asia before he came to Washington to head for Richard Nixon, that famous COINTEL program, and Nixon was president during the zebra killings here, where 14 people were murdered and 7 wounded, and the people in charge of the California violences, I referred to San Quentin 6, the Soledad brothers, and the shootouts, the Marin shootout, and Hugo Pinell and Rochelle McGee. That was all part of the assaults of the Aryan Brotherhood under Keith Gilbert, who was in there at the time for wanting to kill Martin Luther King and being closely with the people who did kill Martin Luther King, John Kennedy, and Robert Kennedy. In 1980, about 3/4 of a year later, November 80, that was the week of the election when Ronald Reagan was elected president, that he would soon be inaugurated, I had a section of that broadcast titled, "Rock Musicians Will Have a Hard Time with Reagan Administration," and I referred to efforts to ban rock concerts, and also the death of rock star Paul Kantner, 39 years old, who had a stroke, who at the time I believe was murdered, and I mentioned that he was founder of the Jefferson Starship in San Francisco. We'll talk about symbolism or a full cycle. When the building burnt down, one of the first people there to help clear out, and a long friend of Bill Graham in the Bay Area, is Grace Slick of the Jefferson Starship. So in 1980, I was talking about the possible murder, or what I thought was the murder of a member of their group, and then a young person who has a stroke, And then 5 years later, the building is gutted down, and what I said he would do to the musicians for the purposes I stated, to stop them being able to meet in large groups and have concerts to protest the wars that he was going to assure that we would have, came down exactly as I said it would. Now, just this last week, there were 1 million people in Spain protesting Ronald Reagan's visit. There were almost that many in Holland yelling at the Auschwitz Pope, the IG Farben Pope, the Nazi who helped the Secretary of the Vatican, Mr. Montini, who became Pope Paul VI, write the passports for the Nazis through the rat line, conceived by Licio Gelli, who was at Ronald Reagan's inauguration, who worked with Henry Kissinger and Fritz KRAEMER, Klaus Barbie, Otto Skorzeny, Martin Bormann, and Joseph Mengele, all one ball of wax. I was talking about these particular people and their relationship to fascism through all these years, but how it would hit America. And as they brought us to the brink of World War III, if there were these musicians alive and you could rally people in 24 hours to get an anti-BITBURG concert, if Bill Graham pulled that in a few hours and had 500 people in San Francisco on just 2 hours' notice, the Chronicle came out in the morning. Imagine what we would have if he wanted a weekend BITBURG concert. He could have 2 million up at Altamont if he wanted to repeat some of the rock concerts that took place. Objecting to December the 7th, 1980, the night before John Lennon was murdered, I did a broadcast on questions about Ronald Reagan. Looking back, what would we look back to? This was 5 years ago. I'd like to run through those questions, and maybe I'll do that next week. But also on part of that broadcast, I mentioned assassination teams from the early 60s that are all in place. If they weren't part of murders, they're part of the cover-up. And one of the people that I detailed in that was John Connolly. And tying John Connolly into the San Francisco scene, the Aryan nations, the Aryan Brotherhood, the Order, the Nazi network throughout the United States. A long while ago, I did have a broadcast on his links to the planned invasion of Dominica. And just to remind people, apropos of the streets of San Francisco now, John Connolly's name was used in undercover tapes with the top Nazis from Canada, Mr. Wolfgang Walter Droge of Toronto, and various Nazis that incidentally hailed Ronald Reagan for calling them, working now down with the CONTRAS, as being freedom fighters. One of them was just released from prison last week who was involved with this mess, Mr. Black. But this group are heavily funded. They talked about it and their racism and their Nazi flags and Gestapo when they were caught trying to invade Dominica and take that over. They're directly linked not only to John Connolly, who was on the board of Permindex, who is part of the World International Cartel, that British-American-Canadian corporation, to rearm Germany, to build up the German munitions cartel, the very people that Ronald Reagan is doing his remembrance and his forgiveness with. John Connolly was part of that Reinhard Gehlen, Clay Shaw group of assassination teams that kill heads of states around the world. And if they don't hold the gun, and even though he was shot, he wasn't meant to be shot through with these fine marksmen. He was hit at Dallas and survived it. He not only was a part of that in 1963 and covered up the murder while he was the governor of that state, but then was named and linked on tapes to Nazis in Klan now, and the Nazi clans here, linked down to the South American Adolf Hitler network that Kissinger set up with the rat line with Gelli and Barbie and Mengele and Martin Bormann and so forth. So that from the World War II, then to the Dallas assassination, the Robert Kennedy assassination, and now into the United States network with the computers and into the police departments permeating in 50 states, that is what we're going to have to deal with in the United States. The people that listen every week know that I've updated these stories for a long time. As a matter of fact, in 1981, I mentioned on broadcast number 522, music blamed for drug abuse, and this was a big harangue against people and rock music, and this was right after, about a year after the murder of John Lennon in 1981, and Nancy Reagan was blaming the rock music for putting people into drugs and still beating that dead body of John Lennon, as if the drug problems in the United States didn't come from the Vatican, from Banco Ambrosiano, from Milan, from the Milan Mafia, Pope Paul VI, the one doing the passports for the Nazis. heavily linked to the drugs, and John Connolly again in the books on the Vatican, linked directly to the Vatican and the narcotic traffickers. Their names come all the way from World War II up through the assassinations into the drug traffic, into the Nazi network, and also with their goals to hang people from Jews and blacks from the poles from one end of this country to the other and follow the Bible of William Pierce, the Turner Diary. Now, last week, the president he just returned from Europe, and the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner had a story that didn't go over the wire services, a picture of Ronald Reagan in a tuxedo with Richard von Weizsäcker. In large, it's a half-a-page article, Awakened Ghosts, a Father on Hitler's Staff, and this is the way it reads. In Bonn, Germany, West Germany, last evening, President Reagan attended a festive state dinner hosted by Richard von Weizsäcker, President of the German Federal Republic. The White House and the press organizations, that's the press organizations that I was writing to, that 100 letters before he went over there, apparently were unaware of the fact that von Weizsäcker's father, Ernest von Weizsäcker, was one of Adolf Hitler's leading and most important diplomats, and that he was convicted as a war criminal in Nuremberg in 1939. Ambassador von Weizsäcker accepted the SS rank in 1939. That's nice and early. He was promoted to brigadier general in Adolf Hitler's Waffen-SS in 1942. This article leaves out the Vatican connections, which is even more insidious. General Weizsäcker was in the height of the Hitler period from the 1930s. He was in the most influential positions in April of 1938. 5 months before the Munich crisis, Hitler appointed him as Secretary of the Foreign Ministry. Von Weizsäcker sat as Hitler's top professional diplomat. He attended many of Hitler's most important meetings and conferences, including one in Berlin in March 1939, at which time Hitler personally bullied President Haka, H-A-C-H, of Czechoslovakia into surrendering what remained of his country after Munich. Now, along with the surrender of Munich, working for the Waffen-SS, working with Baron Ernest von Weizsäcker, was the brother-in-law of Prince Philip, the present husband of the Queen of England. Those exposés came out at the identical time that the president was going to Germany, and the host for this event, photographed at the cemetery, along with the president, was Mr. Richard von Weizsäcker, wearing a hat, sort of looked like a mafia boss. He looks a little better in his tuxedo, I have to say. And they're out at the cemetery where I'm sure his father's friends are buried. And I always felt that as soon as he became president of Germany, it would steer our country much closer than even Helmut Kohl. It's the von Weizsäcker connections. The article says, tried at Nuremberg beginning September 1947, von Weizsäcker argued for his defense, as did all the others, that he didn't know about the camps and didn't know what was going on. But the article goes on to say the U.S. military court rejected von Weizsäcker's claim, saying, in quotes, the German Foreign Office played an important part in the horrors of the concentration camp. In fact, the Waffen-SS set them up. Von Weizsäcker had to realize what the end of this would be. At Nuremberg, von Weizsäcker's defense team included his son Richard, who's now president of Germany, who was an attorney in Nazi Germany, who went on to become the president of West Germany, thanks to Mr. Adenauer and John McCloy and Ronald Reagan and NATO and the powers that be. The lawyer for Adolf Hitler, who defended Hitler's right-hand man, becomes the president of Germany and makes sure that our president is dragged to BITBURG. And it says convicted on several counts. In April 1949, von Weizsäcker was sentenced to 7 years of imprisonment. It was reduced to 5 in 1950, thanks to John J. McCloy. Now, I mentioned a few weeks ago that Mr. von Weizsäcker was in the Rose Garden, along with John McCloy, and I had to read the article twice because he played such a low key. And I understand that there were demonstrations in Washington, and there were going to be big scenes if Richard von Weizsäcker was entertained publicly at the White House, and so that our American media would pick it up. So the President of the United States not only stays at the home of the son of Hitler's godson, where he stayed 3 years ago, but he was coming out. He had to be reelected and get the Jewish vote and get all the votes before he could stay openly at this home and tell whose castle he stayed at. But this article claims, it begins by saying that the European press evidently didn't know. Now, the party was May the 5th, right after the visit to the cemetery, and they're both laughing at each other, looking at each other. They're holding something that looks almost like an Academy Award. And I sent to the White House. It was hand-delivered 24 hours overnight and certified, a special delivery. And on that sheet, many of you have this letter that I sent the president. If you don't have, just send me a postcard and I'll send you a copy. I said, is it a mistake or a coincidence the present president of Germany, Richard von Weizsäcker, is the son of the infamous Baron von Weizsäcker, liaison of the United States of Adolf Hitler to Pope Pius XII, or that the Baron worked with the Vatican for final plans of the United States entry into the Battle of the Bulge. He was very much part of that final stage of getting into the battle. Now, I sent that to the White House, whether they read it or not, or the security. Of course, they don't give a damn, and they hope you won't catch on. But the point is that this was in their hands a while, at least a week and a half before they had their banquet and their parties over the Waffen-SS graves, and the President of the United States gets mingled and tangled into a thing further than he's gone before, and he's been a long way with these people all along. So they tried to cover that up. And then under that article, interestingly enough, and surfaced this past week, big black letters again, and the secret mission to prove to Fuhrer's death. Now, that's something I've questioned also. Once I smoke out Fritz KRAEMER, my last goal is to prove that Adolf Hitler got away, and I work on that simultaneously. But they had to bring this out under von Weizsäcker. It says, London, newly released documents paint a vivid picture of Hitler's last hours. Now, this is the funny part that is new about these documents. They have them locked up for a long time, like Hitler's will, which was the blueprint for what we're doing now. The London Observer said that the new documents describe the end of Adolf Hitler's life, and the mission that Winston Churchill had to find out if Hitler was dead was called Operation Nursery. Isn't that sick? This Hitler and Eva Braun. It's Operation Nursery. Anyway, they sent British intelligence. Brigadier Dick White, who was chief of Britain's MI5, became military intelligence MI6, flew to Berlin, and this is what they found out that was new. The newspaper said the British wanted more evidence that the Fuhrer was dead. So they went on to find two key documents, a diary kept by Hitler's valet. Now I know where the diary came from. Lee Harvey Oswald and Sirhan Sirhan and Artie Bremer and David Berkowitz, those famous telltale diaries. Well, Hitler had a diary too. It goes back to Hitler's diary, and they found a copy of Hitler's will, and it was sewn in the lining of the jacket of a Nazi official who tried to flee. The diary, they said, named everyone in the bunker and their organization. And so Hitler's diary, locked up for 40 years, is found in the pocket of a valet. I'm sure it was meant to be seen with all kinds of instructions. They haven't shown us his diary. They just said it was, we know about the will being a blueprint for what's going on today and how it was sequestered for 40 years. So much for Mr. von Weizsäcker and the BITBURG at this point, but I have a lot, and I'll get back to it later. Now, for the conclusion of this hour, I want to talk about another subject that's been in the news that I've been hammering at for 2.5 years, that finally made the television in somewhat of a half-assed form. NBC Evening News, 5:30 Pacific Standard Time. The authorities at B met in Munich, Germany, and decided that they have to find Joseph Mengele right now, that they have information that he is being funded by members of his family. Well, you know, for 2.5 years, I've told you the money went from his attorney to Zurich, Switzerland, and not all the money, just a particular date, and then recently another date to add to it, but particularly November 13th to 15th, 1982, and how it was deposited for him to use. So all of a sudden, Mr. Simon Wiesenthal, he's offering $1 million this last week. He wasn't interested in Mengele at all. $1 million from Wiesenthal to find Mengele. Israel wants offering $1 million to find Mengele. The same country, David Yallop writes in his book it's on In God's Name, the link of Klaus Barbie to the state of Israel. Mengele and Barbie were very close to Israel, that I have said for a long time is a fascist nation and didn't want Mengele at all. And Germany is offering $1 million to find Mengele, and the United States government is offering money, and Arnaud de Borchgrave, who works with the very people who live with Mengele, and Martin Bormann want Mengele. And why this rush? I've been detailing some of it for you, but now they have to find him. They have to silence Mengele because, one, if they get him alive, and it would be worth $5 or $6 or $10 million to get him alive, you never heard a press conference of Howard Hughes after 1957, except the one that Vance Cooper gave, the voice of Hughes, in 1972, to say that was still used, but he couldn't answer the questions and was never seen. You don't have any press conferences of Klaus Barbie, and you don't have any of Rudolf Hess. Hess couldn't see his wife for 10 years, and then he could never be close to her. We'll do more on Hess later. He had a 91st birthday last week. Oh, speaking about Adolf Hitler, I read that Gaddafi's father died last week. He was 100 years old. So given the conditions of Adolf being a vegetarian and no smoking and the finest food and care, he would be 95, and Gaddafi's father was 100. So a few desert sands and so forth, a little sand in his eye. He lived to be 100, the image of Gaddafi's father not having the advantages of Adolf Hitler. And so don't think the Fuhrer is necessarily dead because he had a birthday in April. It was 95. But again, going back to Mengele, they have to get him and silence him so that you can't hear him or see him anymore. If not, he works closely with Martin Bormann, who the Wiesenthal Center says is dead, but everyone else knows is alive. Bormann is powerful. He could withdraw money from our banks. He might be doing it now. He actually is in a position to crush the American economy and run on the money, play around with the market, and they can blackmail all the heads of states of various countries. So that the financial problems of Mengele with Bormann are key. The money is drawing up because of the narcotic traffic money that went from Klaus Barbie to Mengele's account. The high profit of the narcotics isn't going through those routes now that they've been identified. And also it would destroy the state of Israel if all those starry-eyed and dumb Jews actually knew the relationship of the heads of Israel and the Wiesenthal Center to the existing Nazis from World War II. So the push is on now, and everybody is salivating, let's get Mengele. Now, Simon Wiesenthal, the Nazi hunter, in quotes, said in 1981 that Joseph Mengele has a circulatory disease that he's suffering, that he's tired of being on the run, and he's ready to give himself up or he might commit suicide. Isn't that cute that he had such details in 1981? There was several stories about the Mengele escape by the way of Red Cross, and some of you are interested in the Red Cross and AIDS. One story said Red Cross linked to Mengele alleged, and this tells how they helped him leave Germany and he was under the control of the Red Cross. And there was another story 2 days later in the paper, Red Cross will screen blood for AIDS for virus. And I think Red Cross equals Joseph Mengele and other famous Nazis that they protected. Mengele equals medical experiments and things that could conceive of the work that was done in Fort Derrick, Maryland on the immune system and AIDS that he still could be a part of. And AIDS equals homosexuals, and the homosexuals, the Gestapo, and the Nazis smoked them out so they could kill them. These aren't any conclusions. This is a stream of consciousness. Red Cross helps with AIDS, Red Cross helps with Mengele, and then my next step is, well, Mengele helps get rid of homosexuals, and Mengele creates diseases. And I thought about that. Also, another story that I had a few years ago from 1981, that Joseph Mengele was living in Uruguay, and he was teaching torture at a hospital there. This came out of Tel Aviv, and this is from Mr. Timmerman, the well-known writer, the former editor of La Opinion from Buenos Aires, who said that he met persons who described the inmates, the Jewish inmates. The prison is called Freedom Prison. It's the main center for detention of political prisoners. And in 1981, that Joseph Mengele was doing experimentations on there and teaching the police in Uruguay how to torture. Now, Uruguay has become the center for Reverend Moon. I mentioned that before, for Causa. It is the home of the former Dan Mitrione, the subject of the movie The State of Siege. Incidentally, his son was arrested, and many of you saw it a month or two ago, working for the FBI on huge narcotic traffic charges out of Florida, Fort Lauderdale, and Miami, which is consistent with this pattern of his father and Klaus Barbie and Joseph Mengele, and all of them working together were involved with. They also, the article on Dan Mitrione, there's one that came out recently, how his family suffered when he was killed down in Uruguay. And one of the people who read the funeral services and raised money for this young man who grew up to be a drug dealer was Frank Sinatra, and Frank Sinatra is on the board of the Wiesenthal Center. I don't have enough time to go these interesting full-cycle interconnecting links that have a pattern where they relate back to each other, but Mengele was known, and in 1981 there were quite a few details about his working at a hospital. They could have had him a long time ago. It was only after Klaus Barbie was brought in, and the links of Klaus Barbie to John DeLorean and Joseph Mengele's role receiving the money from Klaus Barbie, that, and I believe just nudging this story along that I've worked on for so long. And then finally somebody was arrested in Germany that began to talk about the drug connections, and then the documents flowed out that our CIA had information all along, 1971, 1980s, of the drug dealing of Joseph Mengele down in South America. And so that the United States government, the Germans, Israel, and Reverend Moon all have a piece of offering $1 million each. They want to get that man, and whoever brings him in, they will have him silenced. They can't afford the shenanigans that are going on now. But there isn't time to do more. I want to continue with a little more about Mengele next week. It all interconnects to Barbie and to Licio Gelli and to John Singlaub and Lev Dobryansky and Reagan's Waffen-SS team. We'll continue here because the hour does run out, and I have to stop for this moment. I'll be back with you next week, and this is Mae Brussell. If you want sheets of bibliography that go with these broadcasts, send a self-addressed stamped envelope. I keep forgetting to remind you to do that. P.O. Box 22511, Carmel, California, 93922. Goodbye.